Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. I want to start off by saying that this video is going to be touching on pretty advanced MBTI topics. If you're new to my channel, just a bit of a disclaimer, I use cognitive personality theory as a bit of a basis, so I'm just expanding on things of cognitive personality theory. I think this video is generally going to help for a deeper understanding of cognitive function theory, and what I'm going to be trying to do is give a sense of underlying structure and try to explain certain things that maybe people have glossed over. Generally speaking, in the MBTI community, I don't hear many people talking about what I'm going to talk about. So to get started with it, I want to clarify something I talked in the last video I made, where I basically said something to the likes of, there's two types of people in this world. There's judging dominance and perceiving dominance. This was my attempt to reconciliate feeling with thinking, considering that they're two sides of the same coin, and perceiving and sensing and intuition. Because it's really hard to say what is the difference between both. If you reduce them to its most basic component, you're left with just judging and perceiving, right? Now, in this video, I want to call attention to the fact that introversion and extroversion are also two sides of the same coin, which means that there's no, we need to collapse them into the coin, but this time leaving feeling, thinking, sensing, intuition separated as they are, which means we're just going to be grabbing the four functions without the I or the E attached to them. So as a bit of a primer on cognitive personality theory, I must point out that the dominant function here is working alongside the tertiary function. In a sense, no cognitive function, as we classically know them, is acting by itself. So a dominant function is always acting alongside the tertiary, to a point that it's really hard for any individual to really separate what is coming from the dominant and what is coming from the tertiary. Let's take, for example, the ESTJ. The ESTJ, when you ask the ESTJ, can you describe extroverted thinking for me? The ESTJ will say many things. In part, some of these things are going to belong to extroverted intuition, and the ESTJ has a hard time differentiating between them, to the point where an ENTJ might listen and not really understand where certain things are coming from. So, given this fact, we have the convergent dominant attitude. So we have the convergent attitude, which is basically the dominant function and the tertiary function, and the divergent attitudes, which are the auxiliary, the divergent auxiliary, and the oppositional function. So, having this in mind, as this primer that I gave you, we'll revisit this in a second. We'll go back to grabbing the functions without them being extroverted or introverted, just feeling, thinking, sensing, and intuition. And we're going to start forming pairs with them. Let's say the ESTJ, right? The ESTJ has thinking as the dominant and intuition as the convergent auxiliary. So here we have a thinking-intuition pair. The divergent functions are the divergent auxiliary of introverted sensing and the oppositional introverted feeling. So here we have a sensing-feeling pair. This means the ESTJ has a intuitive thinking pair and a sensing feeling pair. Now, this intuitive thinking pair and sensing feeling pair, which always go together, by the way, we could actually speculate on why they actually always go together, right? In the sense that I'm not going to get into that, but this always is going to pertain. This particular combination pertains to the beta and the delta quadra, if you think about it. You might have already noticed. So, and if you do intuition with feeling and sensing with thinking, if you do those two pairs, we're actually getting the alpha and gamma quadras. So, I'm going to try and give a bit of an explanation of these four new axes that we have formed. To gain a new nuanced perspective of MBTI, of cognitive functions, which is actually leading to, in the end, it's going to lead to the cognitive networks of CPT and the what is called the four sides of the mind, which C.S. Joseph uses a lot, but I think MBTI in general uses it a lot. I don't know where it comes from, so. So let's start out actually with the beta and delta quadras, which we already did. We have here intuition paired with thinking, and sensing paired with feeling. So I'm gonna start with intuition and thinking. So the first challenge here is to try and separate what thinking is from feeling, and what intuition is from sensing, which is something I'm trying to avoid at all costs, but we need to concede here. So let's just give a very, very broad description, which I'm sure is not going to be correct, all things being, but for general intent, thinking is going to relate to mechanistic conditional workings, sort of let's say like algorithmic. It's very algorithmic. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. Whereas feeling is more of thinking is algorithmic or computational. And feeling is more of an emotional regulator, so it has to do with both internal emotions and also the way we emotionally connect to people, groups of people, and concepts. But it's still going to have an emotional side to it. Okay. Then, separating sensing with intuition. I like to talk about sensing as small frames of reference, which means that we're usually going to be very observant of details when it comes to sensing, whereas intuition is very broad frames of reference, which means they become very, very blurry, but general patterns start being observed or emerge. Given this disposition of sensing to be, sensing is actually going to define frameworks much better than intuition, which tends to break framework type thinking. Not just thinking, as we'll see. Sensing, in this sense, is more connected to the digital black and white world of it's either or type of thinking. Whereas intuition tends to be a more dynamic and always in motion approach to things, where we don't know where something starts or something ends. It works on spectrums rather than on yes or no statements. So, intuition paired with thinking, as I was talking about before, is all about a sort of general logical inference, in the sense that if it's likely to work, then it works. Intuition is very sensitive to probability, for example, which tends to know when there's something's being over-exaggerated or under-exaggerated, undervalued, whatever. So intuitive thinking tends to be very open-ended thinking. It tends to be very it allows for other logical frameworks to fit into its own framework, and it allows a certain open-endedness that its own framework can also flow into other frameworks. So we could call it very spectrum type thinking, right? It's not black and white. It's oriented towards general strategy. So to give an example, even though people say ISTP is very good at tactics, right? This type of thinking is actually quite more oriented towards general strategy. So an example is, for example, is maybe in boxing, we could say. So you're boxing, and a general strategy is I'm going to attack my opponent's right side because their right side is their weak side. So that's a general strategy. There's no actual detailed plan in motion. There's just a general orientation towards what to do. On the contrary side, we have sensing feeling, which this pair tends to be very categorical in nature again. So when it comes towards emotional regulation, group relationships, emotional relationships with other people, it tends to have a certain sense of definition, and it goes, I have actually felt this emotion before, right? So it can pinpoint emotions quite precisely. It tends to keep their friends groups separated, so to speak. So this is my life, this is my work life, this is my social life, this is a friendship with this person is not the same as a friendship with this other person. It's very categorical and black and white when it comes to these emotional connections, we could say, which can be towards concepts, right, towards ideals, such as values and principles. It tends to know exactly when one emotion ends and another one begins, for example. In contrary, I can use this to segue towards intuitive feeling, which belongs to the alpha and gamma quadrants, is much more grandiose and epic in nature. Feelings flow in and out of each other. It is hard sometimes to maybe identify the feeling itself. It always feels like the feeling that's being felt is a new feeling. Or it could sometimes feel like it's feeling all feelings at once. This is very skewed towards FI, what I'm saying right now, but again, are blending in their emotional relationships towards things, right? There seems to be no definite sense of separation there. So it's very open-ended. On the contrary side, this type has sensing thinking, which is very black and white thinking. A more traditional view of thinking, right? This is very precise thinking. It often tends to account for all moving parts, but it's also very rigid in the sense that it's trying to stand the test of time, so to speak. So it doesn't really allow for other frameworks to flow into it, and it doesn't allow for itself to flow into other frameworks. It's very self-contained, so to speak. So it knows where its limits are. This, in fact, actually makes me realize right now that perhaps sensing feeling types might have much clearer boundaries than intuitive feeling types, which have a more improvisational aspect to their boundaries, by the way. Although I'm not sure if that is true, because I'm just saying this off the top of my head. So we can get a general feeling for how these two types are differentiated, right? So essentially here we actually have another version of there's two types of people, which is interesting. So the alpha and beta quadrants form one type of people, and the alpha and gamma quadrants form one type of people, and the beta and delta quadrants form the other type of people. So I'm actually going to go ahead and give them a name. And before I do that, I do want to clarify the boxing analogy, right? where one was strategic and just said, let's attack the right side because that's their weak side. The other one is tactical, which is much more detail-oriented in the sense that, well, let's try to bait a certain move out of them. Once we recognize that they've done that move, we are able to slip past them and perform our own finishing move, which is specifically tailored to attack that side. So there seems to be a much more definite plan here. Rather than a strategy, it's much more tactical. All that said and done, I was going to name both of these types. So the alpha and gamma types, which are the intuitive feelers and sensing thinkers, I'm going to call the architects. Whereas the beta and delta types, which are the intuitive thinkers and sensing feeling types, I'm going to call the engineers. This is because the architects, and this is definitely relating more to their way of thinking rather than to their way of feeling, by the way. Architect types are very rigid in their approach to logic. I've already sort of explained it, but I want to clear it up. Architects create logical frameworks that stand the test of time, and they're in a sense building a structure much like a building, which sure still has its forces and still has its movements, but they're much more hidden. So when we see the structure on a piece of paper, so to speak, there's really no movement to be inferred from it, even though there is. But basically what you see is what you get, in a certain sense. Whereas the engineers, instead of really building a structure or a building, they're more building a train, right? So when they're giving you their model, when they're showing you a train painted on a piece of paper, they're asking you to actually use your intuition to imagine that train in movement, right? How are all these pieces interconnecting? How is it flowing, right? So there's a sense of flow to that sort of logic, which doesn't stand the test of time, but is able to adapt from which came before and to what it will become in the future. So I think those names are pretty fitting for both these types. So now we actually have a sort of compass, where we have, on one side we have two types of people, judging dominance and perceiving dominance, and on the other spectrum of the compass we have the architects and the This doesn't mean this means there is 4 types of people, depending on how we combine these. So the architects can either be perceiving dominance or judging dominance. Let's take the perceiving dominance, for example. These are alpha and beta quadrant perceiving dominance. Alpha and gamma quadrant perceiving dominance, which are the ENTP, ESFP, ISFJ, and INTJ. If only I could define well what's the real difference between a perceiving and a judging dominant, I would be able to go further with this theory. But I am not confident enough to really make such a a defining statement for the moment. I'm still thinking about what being a judging or perceiving dominant really implies. So I will really leave it there, right? So the perceiving dominance of the architects are actually a cognitive network, or the 4 sides of the mind, right? Which is the INTJ, its opposite ESFP, and then the ENTP and its opposite ISFJ. Whereas the judging ones would be, judging dominants are INTP, ENTJ, ESFJ, and ISFP. So we're actually getting 4 new quadras, so to speak, which are the 4 cognitive networks of CPT. And I think it's just a new and interesting way of viewing this, of structuring MBTI in a new way and giving it a new perspective, which is going to help us create a better theoretical foundation in the future, in my opinion. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you next time.